My son is autistic. He did nothing wrong. The man at the bottom of our ramp didn't care. He wore a badge sticker on a cheap vest and a face that thought authority came from a costume. He barked orders like a clipboard parasite who'd swallowed someone else's power. I stepped out onto the porch, and the world narrowed down to his finger shoved at my boy's feet face and the whining static of his fake enforcement. Before we move forward, drop a comment from where are you watching right now. The second the question leaves my mouth, the officer's eyes flick to me like I'm a problem he's already chosen to solve. My pulse stayed low. My training kept my shoulders from flaring. But inside, everything tightened into a warning. A neighbor peeked through blinds 2 doors down. The first witness beat. An unblinking lens that would matter later. The HOA goon didn't flinch. He just insisted, "Your son violated community behavior expectations." That line was a trespassing violation disguised as policy. That line was a rope thrown by a wannabe cop who'd been hired by a petty overlord to police humanity. That line landed like a shove. We'd been here 2 weeks. 2 weeks is barely enough to unpack plates, but long enough for an HOA cult to pick a target. Karen Mallory, the board president, had the kind of face that catalogs people as problems. First she smiled tight, then whispered loud, "They're really letting anyone move in now." She called my son disruptive. She filed visual harmony complaints over a wheelchair ramp. She sent a violation letter claiming disruptive noise, as if a whisper could overthrow property values. That's the authority beat. Our rights under ADA. The right to reasonable accommodation. The deed that lets us modify our home for accessibility. I kept that authority like a blade in my back pocket. I wore my Navy SEAL shirt that morning not to provoke, not to threaten, but because discipline fits me like a second skin. Karen's behavior escalated from disgust to surveillance creep. She photographed the ramp at dusk, muttered about balance, and cultivated a petty overlord's rumor mill. That's when the pattern was clear. The HOA's fake enforcement didn't spring up overnight. It was coordinated. The day she chose to act, her eyes found my truck missing, and she smiled like a predator who smelled a weak herd. She sent her security puppet, a man with a past of campus security complaints and a knack for posturing to our door. He walked up my ramp without permission, boots on my property, a trespassing energy in every step. He pointed at my son as if pointing cancels the law. "This child must be removed from the neighborhood event area," he said, as if HOA policy can supersede a parent's presence on private property. My wife moved between him and our boy. "He's autistic," she shouted. "He didn't do anything." The wannabe cop ignored her. He reached for the wheelchair handles like some entitled parasite, claiming a right to seize people for the sake of visual peace. I didn't move at first. I watched him reach. I felt the camera lens of the neighbor looking, felt the gravity of the moment. That's where everything clicked. That's not even the half of it. When he tried to pull my son, it triggered a set of checks in me that weren't about bravado. This wasn't a fight I wanted, and it wasn't one I planned. It was a violation, a trespassing violation, an intimidation attempt. The training taught me to control, to contain, to act with precision. I stepped forward and positioned myself between the man and my child. My voice was low and steady. "Touch my son again and you'll regret the consequences," I said. The man smirked. He leaned in and said, "Try me." Cheap cologne, cheap bravado, the smell of fake authority. He thought size and attitude would make up for law and ethics. The neighbor's camera caught his smirk. The first piece of proof in a chain. My wife grabbed my arm, whispering, "Don't," but the officer's hand shot forward for the handles again. That move was a line crossed. It was a physical escalation, yes, but mostly it was an escalation of abuse of authority. He believed his role allowed him to take a child from a porch. He believed our rights meant nothing. That belief is the crack you exploit when you expose a fraud. I didn't break him. I stopped him. I locked his wrist, a controlled removal of his ability to claim momentum without injuring him. My hold was a containment, a reminder that his costume gave him no license to violate us. He yelped from the surprise of being restrained, and his posture shifted from boss to embarrassed thug in one breath. He tried to push back, to posture, to call me an assailant. He shouted, "You're assaulting an HOA officer." That word officer is the lie here. The authority beat I carried was the deed. The ADA statutes, witness accounts, the camera ready in a neighbor's hand. I said nothing complicated. I kept my hands visible. I kept my voice measured. I told the neighbor to call 911 and to save the footage. The man's fake authority parasite act began to crack. He tried to recover by reaching for his belt, a reflexive rummage for props, fake cuffs, a baton, the theater of policing. He wanted the theater because he lacked the law. The first cliffhanger. He reached for something. What he exposed next would change everything. When he unlocked his phone later, the texts would tell the truth. But in that second, I locked my grip, forced him away from the ramp and said, "That's strike one." The words landed like a judge's gavel. He staggered, more from humiliation than force. He tried to square up to me, chest puffed, voice cracking. "Try me," he sneered again. But the weight behind it was thinner now, like cardboard. My wife yelled that he put hands on a disabled child. A neighbor pounded on his door and said, "I have this on camera." The man's smirk slipped. That slippage is the fracture point. That moment is where public exposure starts to feel inevitable. That's where the crowd becomes part of the verdict. The timeline matters. We moved in, Karen started a whisper campaign, the officer began patrol runs, and now they'd come to enforce without jurisdiction. My training made me watch patterns and assemble evidence. I documented dates, saved messages, copied violation letters. The neighbor who'd peeked from the blinds volunteered to keep recording. A small authority beat, deed surveys, homeowner rights, and ADA protections sit heavier in court than a badge sticker on a vest. That legal backbone is what I held like a shield. The man lunged clumsily, more for show than contact. I deflected him, forced him down into a posture of apology. I didn't break him. I immobilized his lies. He fell into the role of a man whose career was built on intimidation, not law. The neighbor's phone continued to record. The ring camera blinked, the first hard proof in a chain that would dismantle an entire private enforcement scheme. Here's where everything blew apart. Every sentence here tightens the loop. The HOA cult, the clipboard parasite, the surveillance creep, the fake authority parasite who thought he could confiscate a child's right to be on a porch. The emotional escalation is clear. From insult to invasion, from isolation to being surrounded by witnesses. The father's power position is not brute force, but discipline, legal knowledge, and a controlled strategy to expose the trespassing violation. The villain's behavior upgrades in every line, from whispering behind curtains to sending a paid enforcer to enact a removal. The cliffhanger at the end of this paragraph is the same as the one at the door. Deputies are one call away. The footage exists. Neighbors will testify. The man's next move will either bury him or finish his humiliation. The last paragraph closes on that single hard cliff. The officer lunged again, and he still had no idea what was coming next. We moved into the neighborhood 2 weeks before the fake HOA officer ever set foot on my ramp. But the hostility began the first morning Karen Mallory saw my son. 2 weeks isn't enough time to learn street names, but it's enough time for an HOA petty overlord to choose a family to target. She stood at the end of her driveway with her arms folded, her posture stiff with entitlement, her gaze sliding over my son like he was an eyesore she intended to scrub out of her perfect cul-de-sac. Her smile was thin, clipped, the kind of smile that hides disgust behind fake community pride. She leaned toward her friend and whispered, loudly on purpose, "They're really letting anyone move in now." That was the first clue, the first flicker of HOA mafia energy I'd seen in this neighborhood, the first sign that she viewed the HOA rules as a personal kingdom. My wife squeezed my arm, already reading the danger in Karen's eyes. My son, unaware of the venom behind the stare, traced the pattern on his wheelchair handle and hummed faintly under his breath. That tiny sound, that harmless whisper, would become Karen's excuse for everything that followed. The second day, a notice arrived on our door claiming our wheelchair ramp violated community visual harmony. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a question. It was a threat disguised as a form letter, signed by Karen herself, as if the ADA didn't exist, and our right to accessibility was something she could veto. That was my first authority beat. ADA law outranks HOA preferences. I printed the statute, highlighted the relevant sections, and taped them inside my kitchen cabinet, where I could grab them at a moment's notice. Meanwhile, Karen prowled the street every afternoon with her clipboard, watching us with the stuffed posture of someone pretending to enforce order. Her behavior escalated into whispering campaigns. She told 3 neighbors that my son made disturbing noises, even though he barely spoke above a murmur. She said our family was a disruption to neighborhood consistency. The neighbors she targeted repeated her words with the loyalty of intimidated followers, as if Karen's approval mattered more than truth. That's how an HOA cult starts. One tyrant, a few scared followers, and a system designed to punish anyone who doesn't bow. One evening, I caught her standing at the edge of our property taking pictures of the ramp from 3 different angles. She zoomed in on the railing, muttered to herself, then snapped another shot. I opened the door and she jolted like she'd been caught committing an actual crime. She pasted on her brittle smile and said, "Just documenting." I kept my voice calm, because I learned a long time ago that calmness rattles petty tyrants. "Document whatever you want," I told her. "The law protects this ramp." Her smile cracked. She turned away. That was the second authority beat. The deed, the ADA accommodation already approved by the builder, stamped in the county records. She didn't know I had all of it. She would soon. By the end of the first week, our neighbor Tom pulled me aside. Tom wasn't close to us yet, not a friend, but he'd lived here 15 years and knew Karen's patterns like a man who'd been burned before. He told me about the HOA behavioral monitoring list, a spreadsheet Karen kept with notes about homeowners she didn't like. He said she'd been bragging for months that she wanted to clean up the neighborhood. I asked him what that meant. He looked at my son, then looked away. That's when the truth landed. Karen didn't just dislike the ramp. She disliked my son's existence in her controlled ecosystem. That's when fury started to flicker under my ribs, a flame I kept contained because control is stronger than anger. The next day, another violation letter arrived claiming our son made excessive disruptive noise at 3:17 p.m. The timestamp was during his speech therapy appointment inside our home. He hadn't spoken louder than a whisper. Karen was lying. She wasn't even hiding it. Her villain behavior upgraded into manufacturing documentation to justify harassment. That letter went into my folder. Every violation did. Every whisper. Every photo. I built a record the same way I'd prepare for a mission, meticulous, patient, waiting for the moment where evidence cuts deeper than confrontation. And every time she escalated, she telegraphed what she feared. Families who don't submit. A week before the fake officer incident, We found a folded note shoved under our doormat. It wasn't signed, but we didn't need a signature to know who wrote it. "Some children are not a good fit for this community," it said. Clean, but the message was filthy. My wife cried quietly at the kitchen counter while my son lined up his toy dinosaurs, unaware of the poison someone had slid under our door. I held my wife and promised her this woman would not break us. That was the emotional escalation. Not rage, but resolve. A cold resolve that doesn't burn out. Several days later, Karen stood outside our home again, this time watching the ramp while she talked on her phone. Her voice carried across the driveway. "I don't care what his parents say," she hissed. "He doesn't belong at the event. If he shows up, have him removed." Removed. That word hit like a threat with paperwork behind it. I stepped out onto the porch just long enough to let her know I heard every syllable. She froze, then turned away like she hadn't been caught plotting. She walked off stiffly, but her pace told me she wasn't retreating. She was escalating. The morning it all exploded, my truck wasn't in the driveway because I'd taken it for maintenance. Karen saw an opening. She moved fast. Her text to the fake officer would come to light later. But that morning all I saw was a wannabe cop marching down my ramp with the swagger of someone carrying borrowed power. That's where the cliffhanger lands for this section. The moment Karen decided the absence of my truck meant the absence of my protection. She believed she had the perfect moment to act. She believed her officer could intimidate my wife, seize my child, and claim it was policy. She believed she'd win because she believed we were alone. She was wrong. The deeper we settled into the neighborhood, the clearer it became that the HOA wasn't a community organization. It was a hierarchy built around Karen's ego, enforced by fear, and maintained through intimidation masquerading as structure. The board members didn't speak, they obeyed. Meetings weren't discussions. They were performances staged for Karen's approval. Every rule existed to serve her preferences. Every violation was a weapon she aimed at anyone who didn't fall in line. The HOA didn't operate like a group of neighbors managing shared spaces. It moved like a small-scale regime with its own enforcers, its own gossip network, and its own internal system of punishment for disobedience. That's where the fake officer entered the picture, not as a security guard, but as Karen's personal instrument of control. His uniform wasn't issued, it was purchased. His badge wasn't real, it was self-applied. But in the eyes of residents who feared Karen's wrath, the costume carried enough weight to silence them. Until us. The officer began appearing around our property more often. At first it looked casual, the way petty tyrants test boundaries. A slow walk past the ramp, a glance at the porch, a scribble on a clipboard that had no actual purpose, but the pattern formed quickly. Every time my son was outside, the fake cop wasn't far. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't even subtle. It was surveillance creep disguised as neighborhood safety patrol. One afternoon I caught him standing across the street staring at the ramp like he was calculating how to justify touching it. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Its own gossip network and its own internal system of punishment for disobedience. That's where the fake officer entered the picture, not as a security guard, but as Karen's personal instrument of control. His uniform wasn't issued, it was purchased. His badge wasn't real, it was self-applied. But in the eyes of residents who feared Karen's wrath, the costume carried enough weight to silence them. Until us. The officer began appearing around our property more often. At first it looked casual, the way petty tyrants test boundaries. A slow walk past the ramp, a glance at the porch, a scribble on a clipboard that had no actual purpose, but the pattern formed quickly. Every time my son was outside, the fake cop wasn't far. It wasn't coincidence, It wasn't even subtle. It was surveillance creep disguised as neighborhood safety patrol. One afternoon, I caught him standing across the street staring at the ramp like he was calculating how to justify touching it. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Its own gossip network and its own internal system of punishment for disobedience. That's where the fake officer entered the picture. Not as a security guard, but as Karen's personal instrument of control. His uniform wasn't issued, it was purchased. His badge wasn't real, it was self-applied. But in the eyes of residents who feared Karen's wrath, the costume carried enough weight to silence them. Until us. The officer began appearing around our property more often. At first it looked casual, the way petty tyrants test boundaries. A slow walk past the ramp, a glance at the porch, a scribble on a clipboard that had no actual purpose, but the pattern formed quickly. Every time my son was outside, the fake cop wasn't far. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't even subtle. It was surveillance creep disguised as neighborhood safety patrol. One afternoon, I caught him standing across the street staring at the ramp like he was calculating how to justify touching it. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Permission, and demanded compliance adjustments. Another said he had followed her teenage son home under the guise of safety patrol. A third broke down crying while admitting she'd been too afraid to report him because Karen had threatened to fine her for spreading misinformation. That was the witness beat. Fear-confirmed testimony from those who'd been harassed before us. The HOA wasn't just mismanaged, it was weaponized. People lived under the shadow of fines, threats, and manufactured violations. And Karen had trained them to believe resistance only made it worse. The officer's behavior escalated from lingering to approaching. He once claimed he was checking structural stability of our ramp while tapping on the railing with his knuckles. Another time he walked into our side yard and pretended he'd misread the property line. A lie, a deliberate test, a trespassing violation, a rehearsal for something bigger. Every time he stepped onto my property, I documented it. On the day he returned with a clipboard full of fake forms, I calmly asked him which state agency approved his position. He shifted from foot to foot, dodging the question. That was the moment I knew he wasn't just untrained, he was insecure. The kind of man who clings to fake authority because real authority had never belonged to him. Karen's texts to the board grew more urgent as the days passed. A forwarded message read, "We need to address the new family before the event. Their presence will cause issues." Issues. That was her code for my son existing within her line of sight. Another message. Ensure visual uniformity. Monitor behaviors. Do not allow disruptions. She believed her own language. She believed the HOA was a government. She believed her officer could enforce her will. She believed she could erase my son from shared spaces by calling harassment a behavior evaluation. She believed so strongly she forgot one critical detail. I wasn't the man she thought I was. I wasn't a quiet homeowner she could intimidate. I wasn't someone who feared her violations. I was someone who had taken down far more organized systems of control than a suburban HOA with a clipboard army. The night before everything detonated, I reviewed the folder of evidence while my wife slept beside my son. Photos, videos, violations, emails, footage from the neighbor's camera showing the officer circling our home 3 times in one day. I sat in the dark, calm, steady, and certain. Every pattern pointed toward escalation. Every sign pointed toward Karen pushing her fake officer into a situation he wasn't equipped to handle. And every instinct in me whispered the same warning. They were going to attempt something the next morning. The cliffhanger lands here, at the pivot point where preparation meets inevitability. The moment where the pattern becomes prediction. The moment where Karen sends one final message to her fake officer. A message I wouldn't read until after the entire neighborhood watched her empire collapse. Don't come back without proof he's a threat. She sent it. He obeyed. And not one of them understood what was waiting for them on my ramp the next day. The morning after Karen's last round of whispered threats, I woke before sunrise. Something in the air felt off. The same instinctive tension I'd learned to trust years ago in far darker places than a suburban cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet for a street where sprinklers usually kicked on, and porch lights flickered at random intervals. My son was still asleep, his breathing light and steady, his fingers curled around the stuffed dinosaur he carried everywhere. My wife moved softly through the kitchen, trying not to wake him. Before I even reached for coffee, I checked the ring cam footage from the night before. And there he was, the fake HOA officer, circling, stopping, taking pictures, walking up to the edge of the ramp and leaning in like he was scouting a breach point. 3 passes, 3 attempts, 3 pieces of evidence added to the folder I'd been building. The sight pulled something cold through me. That was the moment I knew Karen's plan was already in motion. I opened the neighbor's shared folder next, the one Tom had set up after realizing Karen had targeted us. His camera caught even more. The fake officer standing at the corner of our lot, phone in hand, receiving a text, then staring at our front door with an intensity that didn't belong on a residential street. The timestamp showed he was there for 12 minutes. 12 minutes of loitering, recording, tracking, waiting. That's surveillance creep masquerading as community enforcement. The emotional escalation tightened behind my ribs, not as fear, not as anger, but as confirmation. Everything aligned with what my instincts had been screaming. Karen wanted documentation. She wanted justification. She wanted to turn her harassment campaign into some twisted narrative about community safety. And she was building it through the lens of a man who shouldn't have been allowed within 10 feet of an authority symbol. My wife came up behind me and placed her hand on my shoulder. "He was here again?" she whispered. I nodded. She looked at the screen, saw the officer's posture, and swallowed hard. "He's planning something," she said quietly. That was the emotional break inside her. A shift from annoyance to fear. But for me, the shift moved in the opposite direction. I felt my breathing slow. My thoughts sharpened. I copied the footage into 3 separate folders and backed it up to a drive I kept in a lockbox. Years of training had taught me this rhythm. When someone escalates harassment into surveillance, the next step won't be subtle. Something was coming. Later that same morning, another envelope appeared on our porch. No knock, no explanation, just slid under the door like contraband. Inside was a printed notice titled Behavioral Compliance Review. It demanded my son's evaluation for disruptive tendencies. It referenced policies that didn't exist. It included warnings about restricted participation in community events. It was unsigned, of course. Karen always knew when silence benefited her. But the wording matched her previous letters too perfectly to be coincidence. This wasn't a form. It was a threat. A manufactured document meant to justify whatever she intended to do next. I placed it on the counter, took pictures from every angle, and then tucked it into the evidence folder. Every line of text would be used against her. The next discovery didn't come from paper. It came from a whisper. One of the quieter neighbors, a man who'd always avoided eye contact with Karen, knocked on our door around 9. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if Karen might materialize behind him. When he spoke, his voice trembled. "I heard her yesterday," he said. "She was talking to him. The officer. She said she was tired of your situation causing trouble." He paused. "She said, if the child resists, proceed with removal." My wife's hand flew to her mouth. My stomach hardened, not in shock, but in recognition. That was the missing link. That was intent. That was Karen admitting motive. The neighbor apologized for not coming sooner. I told him he'd done the right thing. His statement would matter later. It would be one more witness beat to dismantle her story. After he left, I checked the HOA messaging app. Hidden in a side tab labeled Board Only, a tab Karen forgot she gave me access to when we moved in, was a thread filled with her comments about us. Monitor the family daily. Document all irregularities. Ensure compliance. It was all phrased in the sterile language of policy, but every sentence dripped with personal obsession. And then the final message appeared, time-stamped 30 minutes before the officer arrived that morning. If necessary, remove the child for behavioral review. She didn't say escort. She didn't say address. She said remove. That was a legal word, a dangerous word, a word that would be turned against her. I walked outside and stood on the porch for a long moment, watching the street. The sun was rising, washing the pavement in pale gold. A few cars passed in the distance. Sprinklers hummed. But beneath that suburban quiet was a different kind of tension. A tension that pulsed like a heartbeat waiting to sync with something louder. Then I saw him. The officer. Turning the corner in his cheap uniform, walking with a purpose he'd never displayed before. He didn't glance around. He didn't hesitate. He looked straight at my porch the way a man looks at a task he's already accepted. My jaw tightened. My pulse stayed low. The storm was already unfolding. My wife stepped beside me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do we call someone now?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not yet," I said. "We need them to show their hand." It wasn't about risk. It wasn't about letting the moment play out. It was about evidence. Fraud collapses under its own weight when documented. And Karen had built her house of cards high enough for the wind to matter. I wasn't going to push it over. I was going to let it fail in front of witnesses. The final discovery came moments before everything detonated. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a screenshot. Karen's message to the officer. "Don't leave until the child is secured. Parents won't fight back." Secured. That word hit the air like poison. It wasn't policy, it wasn't oversight. It was an attempted abduction disguised as HOA procedure. That was the final authority beat. That was the piece of evidence that turned a neighborhood dispute into something far more serious. And when the officer reached the ramp, hand lifting toward my son's chair, he thought he was walking into a simple task. A routine enforcement. A step toward pleasing his petty overlord. He had no idea every camera was pointed at him. He had no idea witnesses were watching. He had no idea the evidence was stacked against him. He had no idea that the next seconds would dismantle everything he thought he controlled. The moment the fake HOA officer stepped onto my ramp with that manufactured swagger, everything in the neighborhood seemed to pause. It wasn't the quiet of a peaceful morning. It was the quiet before a structure collapses under its own weight. He walked with the confidence of a man who believed the costume made him powerful, who believed Karen's messages were a shield, who believed parents with a disabled child would fold under intimidation. My son's hands tightened on the armrests of his wheelchair. My wife's breath shook suddenly. I stepped forward, not with aggression, not with force, but with a presence that stalled the officer mid-step. Controlled dominance is louder than shouting. It's colder than rage. It makes a man question every lie he built his confidence on. When he reached for the wheelchair handles again, blocked his arm with a clean, decisive motion that carried authority, but no violence. His hand froze mid-air, suspended between intent and consequence. The cameras caught it. The witnesses saw it. His authority evaporated in that single hesitation. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Not at first. Then, scrambling to recover control, he tried to bark his fabricated line about HOA standards, but his voice cracked, and cracks don't hide well in the morning light. "You're interfering with an official action," he stammered. Official. That word hung in the air like a punchline to a joke he didn't realize he was telling. That's when the first deputy patrol car turned the corner. My neighbor must have called the moment he saw the officer approach, and I silently thanked him for understanding the stakes. The patrol car slowed, then stopped in front of our yard. The officer on the lawn tried to salvage the moment, straightening his vest, puffing out his chest, trying to look like someone worth acknowledging. But the deputy didn't even glance at him first. He looked at my son. He looked at my wife. Then he looked at me. "We got a call about an attempted removal of a minor," he said. That single sentence cut the fake authority to pieces. The HOA officer broke instantly, pointing at me like a child caught disobeying rules he invented. "He obstructed me," he shouted. "I was ordered to remove that child." Ordered, remove. Those words sealed Karen's fate long before she arrived on the scene. Another deputy arrived seconds later. The flash of the cruiser lights lit up the cul-de-sac, drawing neighbors from their porches. People emerged slowly, expressions tight with curiosity but shadowed by dread. Everyone knew Karen ruled through intimidation. Everyone knew stepping into anything she touched risked retaliation. But this was different. This had witnesses. This had officers. This had a disabled child at the center. Silence spread across the street like a verdict waiting to be written. The deputies separated us immediately. One spoke to my wife, voice gentle but firm. Another crouched beside my son, ensuring he wasn't harmed. A third faced the fake HOA officer and asked for identification. That was the moment his confidence truly died. He fumbled for his wallet. His hands shook. He mumbled explanations about being appointed by the HOA board. The deputy cut him off. "Appointed to what?" he asked flatly. The officer swallowed hard. "Security." The deputy raised an eyebrow. "Licensed?" The answer stumbled out in fragments. "Not official, but they authorized." The deputy held up a hand. "Stop! Just stop talking." And the crowd felt the shift. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was an exposure. Then Karen arrived. Marching down the sidewalk like she owned the pavement, chin high, eyes blazing with righteous superiority. She saw the deputy, saw the officer on shaky footing, saw the neighbors gathered, and immediately assumed she still had control. "What is going on here?" she demanded. Not asked, demanded. She pointed at me the same way she'd pointed at us since the day we moved in. "Arrest him," she snapped. "He assaulted my officer. He attacked an HOA representative during enforcement." The deputy didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge her command. He simply said, "Ma'am, step back." Karen laughed, the brittle kind of laugh used to hide panic. "I run this community," she said. "You don't tell me to step back." The deputy turned fully toward her, and his voice dropped into that tone only law enforcement can master. The tone that makes liars feel everything they built crumbling at once. "Ma'am, step back now. This is not an HOA matter. This is a child safety investigation." Karen froze. Every neighbor watching felt the shift, the collapse of a tyrant who suddenly realized she wasn't in control. The deputy played the neighbor's ring footage on his tablet. Everyone could see it. The officer grabbing the wheelchair handles, the child flinching, the mother shouting, the officer trying again, the father stepping between. The deputy lifted his eyes once the video finished. "Ma'am, did you instruct this man to remove a child from his home?" Karen's face drained of color. "It was protocol," she hissed. "He was disruptive. I authorized a behavioral review." Another deputy stepped forward. "There is no legal mechanism for an HOA to remove a child from private property." Karen opened her mouth, scrambled for excuses. They didn't come. Then came the final blow. Dun. The paramedic approached, holding the fake officer's phone. His lock screen opened, he said. A message came in. He handed it to the deputy. The deputy read the text aloud, slowly, clearly, for everyone to hear. "Don't leave until the child is secured. Parents won't fight back." Karen's legs seemed to give out for a moment. The entire neighborhood gasped in sync. The deputy looked directly at her. "Ma'am, this message came from your number." She tried to run. She didn't get 3 steps before deputies intercepted her. They didn't shove her. They didn't drag her. They simply placed cuffs on her wrists with the clinical precision of people performing a task they do every day. Karen's scream echoed through the cul-de-sac, high, furious, stripped of all the power she'd weaponized for years. Neighbors watched with the cautious awe of people who'd been under her rule for too long. The HOA cult cracked in real time. The clipboard parasites stepped back. The silent followers stepped farther. The surveillance creeps pretended they never saw anything. No one defended her. Not one person spoke. Her entire empire collapsed the moment she realized the law answered to no HOA. And as she was walked to the cruiser, her officer sat on the curb, head in his hands, the last remnants of his fabricated authority dissolving under the weight of witnesses and evidence. The humiliation was complete. The fall was public. The neighborhood was no longer hers. But that was not the end. It was only the beginning of the fallout I was about to deliver. The moment Karen was driven away in the back of that cruiser, the neighborhood stood still. Not with relief, not with celebration. With the stunned silence of people who had just witnessed the collapse of an entire HOA regime built on fear, intimidation, and fake authority. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Exposure is one thing. Accountability is another. And I intended to make sure every inch of her corrupt system burned under the weight of its own lies. The deputies finished collecting statements. The paramedics finished their assessment. My wife held our son close while neighbors whispered, trying to piece together how the HOA mafia they'd lived under for years had finally cracked. I stood there with the steadiness of someone who had shifted from reacting to executing. The next stage wasn't about confrontation. It was about precision, about dismantling the entire structure they had built, about retaliation done the way professionals handle it, with airtight evidence and cold discipline. As the deputies walked me through the formal report, every piece of proof I'd collected over the past 2 weeks became a weapon sharper than anything physical. I laid out the violation letters, the surveillance footage, the timestamps, the screenshots of Karen's messages. The deputy's eyes hardened with every new document added to the pile. "This isn't harassment," he said. "This is organized misconduct." That was the authority beat. The shift between neighborhood dispute and legal violation. He took notes. He took copies. He asked clarifying questions that were less about verification and more about preparing charges. My training taught me to read body language, and the deputy's posture said it all. They recognized the scale of the abuse. They recognized the deliberate targeting. They recognized the fraud, and they were preparing their case. Meanwhile, the HOA board members slowly drifted out of their homes like soldiers walking across a battlefield after the smoke clears. Some looked ashamed. Some looked terrified. Some looked relieved. One of them, an older man named Harold, approached me with his hands trembling. "I never supported her," he said. "She threatened to fine me into bankruptcy if I said anything." His voice cracked. "She's been doing this for years." That was the witness beat, and his testimony added weight to what was coming. Another board member admitted Karen had pressured them to follow her behavioral standards and penalize anyone who questioned her. A third confessed that the fake officer had never been properly vetted, that Karen had hired him on her own, bypassing any formal approval. Their words were rope. Every admission tightened the noose around the system Karen created. When the deputies left, I began the next phase. I called an attorney I had worked with before, a specialist in ADA compliance violations and homeowner protection cases. He didn't ask me to slow down. He didn't ask me to explain twice. He heard 3 sentences and said, "This is a federal violation and a civil liability event. Document everything. Email me tonight. We'll begin Monday." That was the start of expert retaliation. Cold, factual, legally explosive. The attorney outlined the process. ADA violation filings, civil harassment claims, misconduct complaints, injunction requests, and a petition to dissolve the fraudulent behavioral program Karen had created. He explained that the HOA board would be liable for allowing her to operate unchecked. He explained that every violation letter she issued could be considered evidence of targeted discrimination. He explained that the officer's actions, even without a badge, constituted unlawful conduct under state law. And he explained that the family of a disabled child had strong grounds for compensation. My wife listened with tears in her eyes, not from sadness, relief. For the first time since we moved in, she felt the law on our side instead of against us. Neighbors began coming forward one by one. Tom brought printed screenshots of texts Karen had sent him, demanding he report any unusual activity from our home. A woman down the street offered a voice memo of Karen admitting she didn't want certain kinds of families at the event. A teenager handed me video footage of the fake officer circling our house at dusk 2 nights earlier. Each piece of evidence flowed into the folder, turning it into a mountain. The emotional escalation in the neighborhood transformed from fear to anger. People realized they'd been living under manufactured intimidation. People realized Karen had used her title to bully them into submission. People realized the collapse they witnessed wasn't just about my son. It was about all of them finally seeing the truth. I prepared the full timeline with military precision. Dates, times, actions, violations. The attorney asked for everything arranged chronologically. I worked late into the night while my wife slept beside our son, their breathing twin reminders of why this mattered. Every page I compiled was another strike against the rotten foundation Karen had built. Every screenshot was another crack. Every testimony was another nail sealing her fate. When I sent the file, the attorney responded in minutes. "This is airtight. We move at dawn." Over the next 48 hours, legal notices flooded the HOA board. 1 notice for ADA violation. 1 for harassment of a disabled minor. 1 for enabling unauthorized enforcement activity. 1 for the creation of fraudulent HOA documents. Each envelope was hand-delivered, each signature collected. Each board member's face went pale as they realized the consequences weren't hypothetical. They were personal. They were immediate. They were unavoidable. Some resigned instantly, hoping to escape the fallout. Others begged for leniency, claiming they were victims too. The truth didn't care. The law didn't care. Silence is complicity when you watch abuse and do nothing. And through all of it, I stayed calm. Not because I lacked emotion, because control is louder than chaos. Because retaliation delivered through evidence is cleaner than retaliation delivered through anger. Because humiliation carried out by the system hits harder than anything I could ever do on my own. And when my attorney filed the final petition, one that would force the HOA into federal oversight until a full investigation concluded, it sealed the arc of what they had tried to do to us. They wanted to remove my son from the community. Instead, the community watched them lose every shred of power they thought they owned. The cliffhanger at the end of this section wasn't fear. It wasn't danger. It was certainty. The final phase was coming, and when it landed, it wouldn't be loud. It would be cold, silent, absolute. The day of the final hearing arrived without fanfare, without spectacle, without the noise Karen used to rely on to intimidate the neighborhood into obedience. There were no HOA flyers taped to doors, no whisper campaigns echoing across porches, no clipboard parasites pacing the sidewalks pretending to be in charge. The street was quiet in a way it had never been while Karen reigned over it. A quiet born not from peace, but from reckoning. People watched from windows as my wife rolled my son down the ramp, his fingers tapping gently against the armrest the way he did when he felt safe. For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, the ramp felt like ours again, untouched by harassment, unthreatened by fake authority. I walked beside them, calm, steady, carrying the folder that had dismantled Karen's empire piece by piece. Inside the county building, the atmosphere was clinical, controlled, far removed from the theatrics Karen used to weaponize. She sat in a chair 3 rows ahead of us, hands clasped tightly in her lap, shoulders rigid. Gone was the woman who marched through the neighborhood barking orders. Gone was the petty overlord who believed she could manipulate the law to suit her biases. Gone was the delusion of power she used to hide behind. She didn't look back at us. She couldn't. Not after everything the deputies uncovered. Not after the attorney exposed every message, every directive, every fabricated policy she ever created. Not after the board members she once controlled lined up to give sworn statements about her abuses. Her fake HOA officer wasn't beside her. He wasn't allowed to attend. His future was being handled in a separate process, one that had nothing to do with HOA politics and everything to do with accountability. The judge reviewed the file in silence. Pages turned, screens lit up, footage played. Every piece of evidence we collected carried the same weight. Karen had built an unauthorized enforcement system, targeted a disabled child, orchestrated surveillance creep behavior, fabricated policies, and instructed an unlicensed individual to attempt a removal under false authority. The courtroom was so quiet that even the smallest breath felt amplified. Neighbors filled the back row, faces pale with the realization of how deep the abuse had gone. Some avoided eye contact with us out of shame. Some dipped their heads in apology. Some simply watched, waiting for the verdict that would define the future of the entire community. The authority beat landed when the judge spoke. His voice was steady, clinical, stripped of any emotion. The actions taken by the HOA president constitute harassment, discrimination, unauthorized enforcement, and a violation of federal disability protections. Those words cut through the room like steel. Karen flinched. A board member gasped softly. My wife gripped the handles of our son's wheelchair until her knuckles whitened. Then the judge delivered the part that changed everything. Effective immediately, Karen Mallory is permanently removed from all HOA positions and barred from holding any community authority for life. The phrase for life echoed with a finality that rippled through the room. Karen's shoulders collapsed inward. The arrogance she lived on evaporated. Her reign ended with one sentence. But the defeat didn't stop there. The judge ordered the HOA into mandatory restructuring under third-party supervision. Every false policy, every fabricated program, every fraudulent violation had to be rescinded. Every homeowner previously targeted would receive written apologies and the option for restitution. The board members who allowed Karen's abuse through silence were placed under investigation for complicity. And the fake HOA officer's file, thick with misconduct, past complaints, and new charges, was formally handed to the state for review. His career didn't just crack, it shattered. Whatever future he imagined in enforcement ended the moment he pretended his costume made him powerful. Karen was escorted out of the courtroom, not in handcuffs this time, but in a silence heavier than any metal could create. The neighbors parted as she walked by, each step echoing with the humiliation she had once inflicted on others. None of them offered her comfort. None offered a glance of sympathy. She exited the building surrounded by nothing but the consequences she earned. My wife exhaled a shaky breath she'd been holding for 2 weeks. My son hummed quietly, unaware of the magnitude of what had just unfolded, but sensing the relief in the room. I rested my hand on his shoulder and guided him toward the door. Outside, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, unburdened. People approached us with genuine gratitude, thanking us for exposing the abuse, for standing firm, for not backing down when Karen tried to weaponize authority. Their voices shook with the memory of everything they had endured under her rule. I nodded. I didn't need their thanks. All I needed was what I already had. My family safe, the truth exposed, and the system that tried to intimidate us dismantled from the inside out. We walked up the ramp toward our front door. The same ramp Karen had tried to label as a violation. The same ramp her officer had tried to approach with fake enforcement. The same ramp she believed would be her leverage. My son tugged my hand and pointed at the sunlight hitting the top rail. He smiled. A quiet, simple smile that carried more meaning than any verdict. The neighbors watched from their porches, silent, wide-eyed, unsure what to say. They didn't need to say anything. They'd witnessed the truth. They'd seen the collapse. They knew who had won. And as I opened the door and guided my family inside, the final victory settled over the entire street like a judgment handed down by something older and colder than law. Not one of them could look me in the eye.